The heat inside the saloon was a physical weight, pressing down with the smells of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the bitter smoke of cheap cigars. May stood just inside the swinging doors, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white stones against the soft gray silk of her cheongsam. The dress, her last connection to a life that felt a world away, was clean and neatly pressed, but here it was just another thing that marked her as alien. Every eye in the room had turned to her, a collection of hard, curious, and dismissive glances. The piano player's tune faltered for a moment before resuming its tinny, cheerful rhythm, a sound that felt like a mockery of the cold knot of fear in her stomach. She kept her gaze fixed on the man behind the bar, a large figure with a stained apron stretched tight across his belly. His face was a mask of impatience. She had rehearsed the words in her mind, her English still hesitant, shaped by the few lessons her father had insisted upon before his cough had taken the last of his breath. She took a small step forward, the floorboards sticky under the thin soles of her cloth shoes. "Please, sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the sudden lull. "I am looking for work, any kind. I can clean, I can cook." The man wiped a glass with a dirty rag, not even bothering to look at her fully. He grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. "Ain't got nothing for you here, girl. This is a respectable place." A coarse laugh erupted from a nearby table, and the words that followed were low and slurred, but their meaning was unmistakable, painting a vile picture of the only kind of work they imagined for a woman like her. A flush of shame so hot it felt like a fever crept up her neck, burning her cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible, to dissolve into the grimy floor. Her father had told her America was a land of promise, a place where hard work was rewarded. He had never told her about this kind of poverty, the poverty of dignity, where one's very presence was an offense. She could not bring herself to look at the laughing men. Their faces blurred through the sudden sheen of tears she refused to let fall. She held her head high, a last, desperate act of defiance against the crushing weight of their contempt. "Thank you for your time," she said, the formal phrase a stark contrast to the room's vulgarity. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and pushed her way back through the swinging doors, escaping into the blinding, dusty glare of the afternoon sun. The heat outside was no less oppressive, but at least it was clean. She stood on the boardwalk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, with nowhere to go and nothing to her name but the clothes she wore and a memory of a home she could never return to. The world had become a narrow, hostile street in a town with no name that mattered, under a sky that offered no comfort. She did not know how long she stood there, a solitary gray figure against the raw lumber of the storefronts, the sounds of the saloon a dull roar behind her. The shame had cooled to a hollow ache, a familiar companion in the weeks since her father's passing. The town offered nothing. She had tried the mercantile, the hotel, the smithy. Everywhere the answer was the same, a shake of the head, a suspicious stare, a door quietly closed. The saloon had been her last hope, a desperate gamble that had ended in humiliation. Now there was nothing. The thought was a vast, empty space inside her. She drew a ragged breath, the dust catching in her throat, and was about to take a step toward the edge of town, toward the open prairie that promised only a different kind of death, when a voice spoke from beside her. It was quiet, hesitant, and so unexpected that she flinched. "Ma'am?" She turned her head slowly, her body still rigid with defensiveness. A man stood there, his shadow falling long in the afternoon light. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a plain cotton shirt, his face shaded by the brim of a dusty hat. He was not looking directly at her, but rather at a spot on the boardwalk just past her shoulder, as if addressing her was an act that required immense effort. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. He had been in the saloon. She remembered his stillness in a far corner, a quiet island in the sea of noise. He had seen it all. The thought sent a fresh wave of shame through her. He started, then cleared his throat and tried again, his voice low and rumbling. I saw what happened. In there. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. They were a startlingly clear blue, set in a sun-weathered face, and they held no mockery, only a kind of grave seriousness. She said nothing, merely watched him, her heart resuming its frantic beat for an entirely different reason. There was no threat in his posture, only an awkward uncertainty. My name is Thomas. I have a ranch, a few miles east of here. He paused, as if the words were heavy objects he had to lift one by one. It's quiet out there. Just me. He swallowed, and the motion was visible in his throat. His gaze dropped back to his hands, to the hat he was worrying into a new shape. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the buzz of flies. She waited, unsure what he wanted, what this strange, shy man was trying to say. Then he looked at her again, his expression earnest, almost pleading. I need a wife, he whispered, the words so soft she almost didn't catch them. He seemed to gather himself, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence. I need a wife like you. The words hung in the hot, dry air between them. A wife like you. They were not the words of a romantic suitor, nor the crude proposition she had feared. They were a statement of fact, stark and unadorned, yet they held a meaning she could not immediately grasp. Like her? A woman publicly shamed, destitute, and utterly alone? What could he possibly mean? She stared at him, at his earnest, sun-creased eyes and the nervous tension in his hands as he continued to mangle the brim of his hat. He looked as uncomfortable as she felt. Her mind, numb with despair only moments before, raced to make sense of his offer. It was a proposal of convenience, she understood that much, a transaction. He needed a wife to manage his home, to fill the quiet spaces of his ranch. And she needed to survive. It was a lifeline, thrown by the most unlikely of people in the most unexpected of ways. Yet it was the thought of marriage, of binding herself to this complete stranger, that made her hesitate. Marriage was meant to be built on family, on shared understanding, on affection. This was a contract born of desperation and loneliness. Why? The word escaped her lips, small and fragile. It was the only question that mattered. Why her? Why choose a foreign girl from the doorway of a saloon? Thomas seemed to take the question seriously. He stopped twisting his hat and thought for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the vast open land at the end of the street. You're quiet, he said finally, his voice still low. And you have a strength. I saw it. In there. He gestured vaguely with his head toward the saloon. You didn't cry. You didn't shout. You just stood. There's a strength in that. He looked back at her, a hint of something like admiration in his eyes. My life is hard. The land is hard. I need a woman who is strong in that quiet way. He wasn't talking about the strength to lift heavy loads or plow a field. He was talking about the resilience of the spirit, the ability to endure. He had seen past the gray silk of her dress and the strange cadence of her speech, and had recognized the steel in her spine. It was the most profound compliment she had ever received. She thought of her father, of his quiet endurance as illness wasted him away. She thought of her mother, whose gentle hands could calm any storm in their small home. They had taught her that strength was not about noise, but about holding on. This stranger, this quiet rancher, had somehow seen that heritage in her. The alternative was starvation, or worse. There were no other doors open to her. This was a door, not to a life she had ever imagined, but to a life. I can cook, she said, her voice steadier now. I can clean. I will work hard." It was her acceptance, her own terms of the contract. She was not offering herself as a wife in the romantic sense, but as a partner in labor. He seemed to understand. A small, almost imperceptible wave of relief washed over his features. He nodded slowly. "I know you will." He put his hat back on his head, a gesture that seemed to settle the matter. "We'll go to the preacher first, then the mercantile for supplies. You'll need a proper dress, something for the ranch." He said it so practically, as if he were planning a trip to buy feed, but the mention of a proper dress, the unspoken acknowledgment that her Chong Sam was not suitable for this new life, sent a small pang through her. It was another piece of her old self she would have to leave behind. "My name is May," she said softly, offering this small piece of herself in return. He repeated it, the sound unfamiliar on his tongue, but spoken with care. "May." He nodded again. "It's good to meet you, May." And with that, the transaction was sealed. He turned and began walking down the boardwalk, his long strides measured and sure. After a moment's hesitation, May gathered her resolve and followed him, a small gray shadow trailing a tall, sun-beaten stranger toward an unknown future. The preacher was a thin, severe man with watery eyes who seemed unsurprised by the unusual pairing before him. He asked the necessary questions in a droning monotone, his gaze flickering between Thomas's stoic silence and May's bowed head. The ceremony was brief, stripped of all sentiment, a legal formality conducted in a dusty, sun-bleached office that smelled of old paper and dry rot. May's responses were whispers, lost in the vastness of the commitment she was making. When the preacher declared them man and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace. Thomas simply paid the man a few coins, received a signed paper, and tipped his hat. "Thank you, Reverend," he said, his voice flat. He then turned to May, his expression unreadable. "We need to get those supplies before sundown." The transition from stranger to husband had taken less than 10 minutes. At the mercantile, the proprietor, a woman with a kind but weary face, looked at them with open curiosity. Thomas spoke to her in low tones, explaining the situation with a bluntness that made May's cheeks burn. "This is my wife, May. We've just been married. She'll be needing some things." The woman, Mrs. Gable, turned her gaze on May, and for a moment May braced herself for another look of pity or suspicion. Instead, the woman's eyes softened with something that looked like compassion. "Well, congratulations to you both," she said, her voice warm. "Let's find you something sturdy, dear. The dust out here is unforgiving." Mrs. Gable led her to a small collection of ready-made dresses, their calico and gingham fabrics a world away from the smooth silk of her cheongsam. May chose two, simple and functional, their patterns muted and unremarkable. She also selected sturdy boots, stockings, and a sunbonnet to protect her from the fierce sun. As Thomas paid, Mrs. Gable slipped a small, cloth-wrapped package into May's hand. "A little something to start your home," she whispered. "Every home needs a good needle and thread." May looked down at the small gift, a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated kindness she had received from a woman in this new country. She murmured her thanks, her voice thick with emotion. The journey to the ranch began as the sun started its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. They rode on horseback, Thomas on a large roan and May on a gentler mare he had procured from the livery. He had tied her few belongings, the new dresses and the small bundle containing her cheongsam, into a roll behind his saddle. May had never ridden a horse before, and she clung to the saddle horn, her body stiff with a mixture of fear and wonder. The town quickly disappeared behind them, swallowed by the immense rolling landscape. The prairie was not flat as she had imagined, but a living sea of grass that rippled and swayed under the evening breeze. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of leather. Thomas rode slightly ahead of her, a silent, solitary figure against the vastness. He did not speak, and May, lost in the overwhelming scale of her new reality, had no words to offer. She watched the way he sat in the saddle, with an ease that spoke of a lifetime spent in this wild, open space. This was his world, a world of earth and sky, of silence and solitude. And now, somehow, it was her world too. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion and a fragile, tentative curiosity. She was married. She was riding toward a home she had never seen. Her life had been irrevocably altered by a quiet man's desperate, whispered words. As darkness began to settle, she could see a faint light twinkling in the distance, a tiny spark of gold in a sea of deepening blue. "That's it," Thomas said, his voice startling her out of her reverie. "That's home." The house was small, a simple structure of weathered wood that seemed to have grown organically from the land itself. It was stark and unadorned, flanked by a sturdy-looking barn and a series of corrals. A single lamp burned in the window, the source of the light she had seen from a distance, a lonely beacon in the immense dark. As they dismounted, the silence of the prairie was replaced by the lowing of cattle somewhere in the darkness, and the soft nicker of their horses. Thomas took the reins of her mare and led both animals toward the barn. "You can go on inside," he said over his shoulder. "Door's unlocked." May stood for a moment, clutching the small package from Mrs. Gable, and looked at the house that was now her home. It was nothing like the crowded, noisy tenement where she had lived with her father, nor the ornate houses of her homeland. It was something else entirely, a place of profound isolation. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room, meticulously clean but starkly furnished. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, its surface gleaming. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. In one corner was a bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt. A few shelves holding tin plates and cups, a small pantry, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin completed the furnishings. There were no pictures on the walls, no curtains on the windows, no personal touches to soften the room's austerity. It was a space for survival, not for living. The loneliness of the room was a palpable thing, a silence that was deeper than the silence outside. This was the home of a man who had been alone for a very long time. May walked over to the table and placed her small package on its surface. She ran a hand over the smooth, scrubbed wood. This was her kitchen, her dining room, her bedroom. This was her life. When Thomas came in a few minutes later, he seemed to fill the space, his broad shoulders making the room feel smaller. He didn't look at her, but went straight to the stove. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his back to her. "I can make something." "I can do it," she replied softly. It was the first domestic act of their marriage, this small negotiation over the evening meal. He seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of the new dynamic, then stepped aside. "The pantry has flour, beans, some bacon. Water's in the bucket from the well." He showed her where everything was with brief, economical gestures. While she moved about the small space, measuring flour and slicing bacon, he sat at the table watching her. His gaze wasn't intrusive, but observational, as if he were studying a strange new creature in its habitat. The silence felt charged, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. She cooked with the quiet efficiency her mother had taught her, her hands moving with a familiar rhythm that was a comfort in this strange new place. The smell of frying bacon and baking biscuits soon filled the room, chasing away some of the cold loneliness. They ate in silence, the clinking of their forks against the tin plates the only sound. The food was simple, but after a day of fear and upheaval, it felt like the most luxurious meal she had ever eaten. After they finished, she cleared the table and washed the dishes in the basin, her movements economical and precise. When she was done, she turned to find him still at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He gestured toward the bed. "You can take the bed," he said. I'll sleep by the fire." It was an act of consideration she hadn't expected. She looked at the bed, then at the hard floor. "It is your bed," she said. "We can share it." The words were bold but practical. They were husband and wife. A shared bed was part of the arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face in the lamplight. She saw a flicker of something in their depths: surprise, uncertainty, perhaps even gratitude. He gave a slow, single nod. "All right," he said, his voice rough. He stood and began to prepare for the night, and May, her heart aflutter with a nervous, uncertain rhythm, turned away to give him his privacy, her new life stretching before her in the quiet, shadowed corners of the small wooden house. The days settled into a quiet, unvarying rhythm. May rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and moved silently through the dark house to light the stove. The first time she did this, Thomas had woken with a start, sitting up in bed as she struck the match. He had watched her for a moment, a strange expression on his face, before lying back down without a word. Now he simply stirred, a silent acknowledgment of her presence as she began the day's work. She would make coffee and biscuits, and they would eat together in the pre-dawn quiet. Then he would pull on his boots, take his hat, and head out to the barn, not to return until the sun was high in the sky for the midday meal. His absence filled the house with a profound stillness. At first it was unnerving. The silence was a vast, empty canvas, and May found herself listening for any sound: the wind whistling around the corners of the house, the distant cry of a hawk, the lowing of the cattle. She cleaned the small house until it shone, scrubbing the floors and washing the single window until the glass was invisible. She organized the pantry, arranging the tins and sacks with a precision that was both satisfying and a little desperate. She was defining her territory, making her mark on this stark, masculine space. But the house was too small, the chores too few to fill the long, empty hours. Her mind, so long occupied with the single desperate goal of survival, was now adrift. She found herself standing at the window, looking out at the endless expanse of grass and sky, feeling as small and as lost as she had on that first day in town. One afternoon, while mending one of Thomas's shirts, she discovered the small package Mrs. Gable had given her. Inside were several spools of colored thread, a packet of fine needles, and a small, sharp pair of scissors. It was a simple gift, but to May it was a treasure. The next day, after Thomas had left, she took out the plain calico dress she wore every day. Using the bright thread, she began to embroider a small, intricate pattern of flowers along the edge of the collar, tiny, vibrant blossoms of red and blue and yellow. The work was slow and detailed, requiring all of her concentration. As she stitched, the world narrowed to the point of her needle, to the feel of the thread pulling through the coarse fabric. It was a piece of her old life, a skill her mother had taught her, this ability to create beauty out of simple things. The quiet house no longer felt empty, but peaceful. The silence was a space for creation. When she finished the collar, she started on the cuffs, her fingers moving with practiced grace. She was not just mending or decorating, she was claiming the dress, transforming it from a symbol of her new, harsh life into something that was hers. A few days later, when Thomas came in for his midday meal, he paused in the doorway. He said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the colorful stitching at her throat. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, suddenly self-conscious. She had done it for herself, to quiet the loneliness, but now he had seen it. He walked to the table and sat down, his movements as deliberate as always. She served him his food, her hands trembling slightly. As he ate, he kept glancing at her, not at her face, but at the small, bright flowers on her collar. Finally, as he was finishing his meal, he spoke, his voice quiet. "It's nice," he said, gesturing with his fork toward the embroidery. The colors. It was a small comment, but it was more than he had ever said about her appearance. It was an acknowledgment. He had noticed. He had seen the small piece of beauty she had created in the midst of all this emptiness, and he had approved. A warmth spread through her chest, a fragile, hopeful thing. That evening, after the chores were done, he did not immediately retreat into his usual silence. He lingered at the table while she washed the dishes. "My mother," he said, his voice hesitant. "She used to make things. Quilts. With lots of colors." May turned from the wash basin, her hands dripping. He was looking at the patchwork quilt on their bed, his expression distant, tinged with a sadness she had not seen before. It was the first time he had spoken of his family, the first crack in the wall of his solitude. She simply nodded, sensing that words were not what he needed. But she understood. He was telling her that he recognized the impulse to create, to bring color and warmth into a hard world. He was telling her that, in some small way, he understood her. The next week, Thomas returned from a trip to town with the usual supplies of flour, coffee, and salt. But this time, there was another, smaller parcel wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on the table without a word and began to unload the other goods, his focus entirely on the task. May watched the parcel, her curiosity piqued. He made no move to open it or explain it. He finished his work, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the table, waiting for the evening meal as if nothing were out of the ordinary. The small package sat between them, a silent question. She served the food, her movements quiet and deliberate, her mind racing. Was it for her? Was it something for the house? His silence was a kind of test, she thought. She ate her meal, her eyes straying to the package. Finally, when they had both finished and she had cleared the plates, she could bear the suspense no longer. She looked at him, her expression questioning. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the package. "It's for you," he said, his voice low. Her fingers fumbled with the string. Inside the paper were several small cloth sacks. She opened one and poured the contents into her palm. Seeds. Tiny, dark specks, full of promise. She opened the others. There were seeds for beans and squash, for hardy greens, and in the last packet, seeds for a flower she did not recognize, the picture on the paper showing a cheerful, sun-colored bloom. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a pleasure so sharp it was almost painful. It was more than just seeds for a garden. It was a gift of purpose. It was an acknowledgement that she was not just a housekeeper, but a creator, a nurturer. It was a gesture that said he wanted her to put down roots, here in this lonely soil. "For a garden," he stated, as if she needed the explanation. "There's a good patch of earth by the side of the house. Gets the morning sun. The well water will hold if you're careful with it." He was giving her a piece of his land, a place to cultivate and make her own. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate to express the swell of emotion in her chest. She clutched the small sacks of seeds as if they were jewels. The next morning she was outside at first light, her hands in the cool, dark earth. Thomas had already tilled a small square of land for her, his silent act of preparation another layer to his gift. The soil was rich and loamy. She spent the morning planting, carefully spacing the seeds, her fingers pressing them into the ground with a tenderness that was almost prayerful. For the first time since arriving in this country, she felt a connection to the land. It was no longer a vast, intimidating emptiness, but a place of possibility. Each day she tended her small garden, watering it sparingly from the well, pulling the tiny weeds that sprouted between her rows. It became the focal point of her days, a living, growing thing that depended on her. Thomas would watch her sometimes from the barn doorway, his expression unreadable, but he never interfered. He had given her this space, and he respected it as hers. Weeks passed. The first green shoots broke through the soil, delicate and miraculous. May felt a thrill of victory, a deep, quiet joy. She had brought life to this barren patch of ground. As the plants grew stronger, so did the fragile bond between her and Thomas. The silence in the house began to change. It was no longer an empty, awkward thing, but a comfortable quiet, a shared peace. He started talking more, not about feelings, but about the ranch. He told her about the cattle, about the way he could read the weather in the sky, about the different grasses on the prairie. He was sharing his world with her, piece by piece. One evening, as they sat at the table, she was mending another of his shirts, the needle flashing in the lamplight. She had finished the embroidery on her own dresses and had, tentatively, begun to add small, subtle touches to his things. A reinforced seam stitched in dark blue thread, a tiny, almost invisible leaf embroidered near a mended tear. He reached out and touched the sleeve of the shirt she was working on, his calloused finger tracing the line of her stitching. "You have good hands," he said quietly. "You make things better." She looked up, and his eyes met hers across the table. In their blue depths, she saw a warmth and a respect that went far beyond their practical arrangement. It was a look that made her heart skip a beat, a look that spoke of a different kind of need, a need for the beauty and care her hands provided. It was a look that felt, astonishingly, like the beginning of love. The summer deepened, settling over the prairie in a wave of dry heat. Dust devils danced across the plains, and the sun beat down with a relentless intensity. May's garden, which she watered with painstaking care every evening, became a small, defiant patch of green in the vast, sun-bleached landscape. The bean vines climbed the simple trellis she had built, and the squash plants unfurled their huge, verdant leaves. One afternoon, the sky began to change. The clear, searing blue was slowly consumed by a bruised, yellowish gray that crept in from the west. The air grew heavy and still, the usual prairie breeze dying completely. A strange, oppressive silence fell, and even the cattle seemed to grow quiet. May was outside, securing a loose vine, when Thomas came riding in from the far pasture at a gallop, something she had never seen him do. He swung down from his horse before it had even come to a full stop. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp with an urgency that startled her. "Now, and bring in the water buckets." He didn't wait for her reply, but immediately began striding around the small homestead, checking the latch on the barn door, securing the corral gate. May hurried to obey, her heart beginning to pound with a nervous rhythm. She filled the buckets at the well and lugged them inside, her arms straining. The air was so thick it felt hard to breathe. By the time he came inside, the sky outside the window was almost black, though it was only mid-afternoon. He barred the door, a heavy wooden beam she had never seen him use before. "It's a big one," he said, his face grim as he looked out the window. "A dust storm." He lit a second lamp, and the small room glowed with a warm, fragile light against the unnatural darkness outside. The first gust of wind hit the house like a physical blow, making the timbers groan. A low, menacing roar began, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. May shrank back from the window, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard stories of these storms, of how they could strip paint from wood and suffocate livestock. The roar grew louder, and soon the air was filled with a high-pitched, whistling shriek as the wind forced its way through every tiny crack and crevice. A fine, gritty dust began to seep into the room, coating every surface in a thin brown film. It was in her mouth, in her nose, a constant, choking presence. Thomas had dampened 2 cloths and handed one to her. "Breathe through this," he instructed. The storm raged for hours. The world outside the window was a churning, opaque wall of brown. The noise was deafening, a relentless assault on the senses. May sat on a stool near the stove, her hands clenched in her lap, trying not to show the terror she felt. This was the wildness of this land, its raw, untamable power. Thomas did not sit. He paced the small room like a caged animal, from the door to the window and back again, his boots scuffing on the thin layer of dust that now covered the floor. He was checking the integrity of his home, of the small shelter he had built against this very chaos. At one point, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and a loud crack echoed through the room. A piece of the roof had given way. Dust and debris rained down near the pantry. May cried out, a small, sharp sound of fear. In an instant, Thomas was at her side. He didn't say anything, but he put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of pure, grounding reassurance. "It's all right," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the storm. "The main beams will hold. The house is strong." He kept his hand there, a warm, solid weight that anchored her in the midst of the terrifying noise. She leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his calm. They stood like that for a long time, two small figures in a pool of lamplight, listening to the world try to tear itself apart around them. In that moment, the last of the transactional nature of their marriage seemed to be scoured away by the wind and the dust. He was not just the man who had offered her survival. He was her husband, her protector. And she was not just his housekeeper. She was the person he was protecting. The storm was a terrifying, destructive force, but inside the small, sturdy house, something new and resilient was being forged between them. The storm finally blew itself out sometime before dawn. The deafening roar subsided into a low moan, then faded into an eerie, profound silence. When the first light of morning filtered through the dust-caked window, it was weak and diffused, as if the sun itself were exhausted. Thomas unbarred the door and pushed it open. The world outside was transformed. A thick blanket of reddish-brown dust covered everything, smoothing sharp edges and filling hollows. It lay in deep drifts against the side of the house and the barn, like dark, gritty snow. The air was still thick with haze, and the smell of damp earth and dust was overwhelming. Thomas surveyed the damage with a grim expression, his jaw tight. May stood beside him in the doorway, her heart aching at the sight. Her garden, her beautiful patch of green, was gone. It was completely buried under a heavy layer of dust. The bean trellis had snapped, and only the very tops of the sturdiest squash leaves were visible. All her work, all that tender care, erased in a single night. A knot of grief tightened in her throat. It felt like a personal loss, a final reminder from this harsh land that nothing was permanent, that beauty was fragile. She felt a tear escape and trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, not wanting him to see her weakness. But he had seen. He turned his head and looked at her, his expression softening. He said nothing about the garden. Instead, he looked toward the horizon, where the sun was a pale disk in the hazy sky. "The cattle will need water," he said, his voice practical but gentle. "The dust clogs everything. It's a long day ahead." It was his way of saying that life went on, that there was work to be done, that morning had to wait. She understood. She nodded, took a deep breath of the dusty air, and went back inside to restart the fire in the stove. The day was a blur of hard, relentless labor. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. They shoveled the heavy drifts of dust away from the door and the path to the well. Thomas climbed onto the roof to inspect the damage, while May began the monumental task of cleaning the house. Every surface was coated in a gritty film. She swept and scrubbed, washed and wiped, trying to restore order to their small sanctuary. The work was exhausting, but it was also a balm, a way to fight back against the chaos the storm had unleashed. When Thomas came back inside, covered in dust and sweat, he found her on her hands and knees, scrubbing the last of the grime from the floorboards. He stopped and watched her for a moment. "You should rest, May," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "You've done enough." She looked up at him, her own body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. "It is our home," she replied simply. It must be clean." He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down heavily, running a hand over his face. He looked utterly spent, but as he watched her finish her task, a look of deep, quiet respect settled on his features. That evening, after a simple meal eaten in near silence, they were too tired to speak. May was tending to a small cut on her hand, a casualty of the day's cleaning, when Thomas came and stood before her. He held out a small tin of salve. "For the cut," he said. She took it from him, their fingers brushing. The brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through her. She applied the soothing ointment, and he remained standing there, watching her. "The garden," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I'm sorry about the garden." She looked up, surprised. "It is not your fault. It is the land." "I know," he said, "but you worked so hard on it." He hesitated, then reached out and gently took her hand, turning it over to look at the palm. It was no longer the soft hand of the girl who had arrived months ago. It was calloused and capable, marked by work. "We'll plant it again," he said, his thumb stroking softly across her palm. "When the rains come, we'll build a better fence this time, to protect it." His touch was gentle, reverent. It was the most intimate gesture he had ever made. She looked from his hand holding hers to his face, and in his tired, earnest eyes she saw the truth of his words. He was not just offering to rebuild a garden. He was offering to rebuild hope. He was promising her a future they would build together, one that could withstand the storms. In the quiet of the newly cleaned house, with the smell of salve and wood smoke in the air, May felt the last of her fear and loneliness dissolve. Replaced by a feeling so warm and steady, it felt like coming home. In the weeks that followed the storm, a new intimacy grew between them, as quiet and as steady as the prairie grass re-emerging from the dust. The shared trial had stripped away the last vestiges of their formal arrangement, leaving behind a foundation of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken tenderness. He began to seek out her company. Not just at meal times, but in the evenings, he would bring a piece of leather harness into the house to mend, just to be in the same room while she sewed. Sometimes he would tell her stories about his childhood on this very land, about his father, a man as quiet as himself, who had taught him how to read the seasons and understand the cattle. He spoke of his mother, the one who loved colors, who had died when he was just a boy, leaving the house as silent and gray as it was when May first arrived. As he spoke, May began to understand the profound loneliness that had shaped him, the deep well of solitude from which he had spoken that day in town. He had not just needed a wife to cook and clean. He had needed a presence to fill the crushing silence, a quiet strength to mirror his own. And she, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She told him about her home in a faraway province, about the scent of rain on the dusty streets of her village, about her father's dream of a better life. She spoke of her mother's hands, how they were never still, always cooking or sewing or tending to her small collection of herbs. In sharing these memories, she was giving him the pieces of herself that she had kept locked away, the parts that defined her beyond the gray cheongsam and the label of outsider. One evening she retrieved the silk dress from the small bundle where she had stored it. The fabric was still smooth, the gray color as soft and muted as ever. She ran her hand over it, the memories it held washing over her, the shame of the saloon, but also the dignity her mother had stitched into its very seams. She was standing by the window, holding the dress, when Thomas came in from his final check of the animals. He stopped when he saw what she was holding, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft on the clean floor. He looked from the dress to her face. "That's the one you were wearing," he said softly, "the day we met." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. "I was so afraid that day," she whispered, the confession slipping out. "I had nothing left." He reached out, not to touch the dress, but to gently cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch was warm and sure. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I didn't see a woman who had nothing. I saw everything I was missing." His blue eyes were full of a raw, honest emotion that made her breath catch. "I told you I needed a wife like you. I think I knew, even then, what that meant. It didn't just mean strong or quiet. It meant good. It meant kind. It meant you." He took a deep breath, the confession costing him. "The house was just a place to sleep, May. You've made it a home. You brought the color back." He gestured around the room, at the small embroidered flowers on the dish towels, at the pot of hardy wildflowers she had found and placed on the windowsill, at the warmth that now filled the once empty spaces. His gaze came back to hers, intense and unwavering. "I didn't just need a wife," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I think I needed you. I love you, May." The words, so simple, so direct, landed in her heart like a soothing balm. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the loneliness she had carried for so long finally melted away in the warmth of his gaze. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of overwhelming, unexpected joy. "I love you, Thomas," she whispered back, and the words felt like the most natural thing she had ever said. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not born of duty or arrangement, but of a deep and patient love that had grown slowly, like a hardy prairie flower in the most unlikely of soils. A year passed, then another. The seasons turned, each one leaving its mark on the land and on the two people who called it home. The ranch was no longer a place of stark survival, but one of quiet, thriving life. The garden, replanted and protected by a sturdy fence Thomas had built, flourished. It provided them with vegetables through the summer and autumn, and May learned to preserve the bounty in jars that lined the pantry shelves, their colors like jewels against the dark wood. The house, too, had transformed. Curtains, sewn by May from fabric Thomas had bought her, now framed the window, softening the harsh light. A braided rug, her winter project, lay on the floor, its warm colors a welcome sight on cold mornings. The patchwork quilt on the bed had been joined by another, one they had worked on together during the long winter evenings, his large, clumsy fingers learning to push the needle under her patient guidance. Their life was woven together by these shared tasks, by a rhythm of comfortable companionship. Their love was not a thing of grand pronouncements or passionate displays. It was a quiet, steady presence, as reliable as the sunrise. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee in the morning, just as she liked it. It was in the way she made sure his favorite meal was waiting when he came in, weary from a long day. It was in the shared silence as they sat on the small porch he had built, watching the sun set over their land, painting the sky with the same fiery colors that had heralded her arrival. It was a love expressed in small, daily acts of care and consideration. One warm summer afternoon, Thomas found May sitting on the porch steps, a small wooden box on her lap. Inside, carefully folded, was the gray silk cheongsam. She was not looking at it with sadness, but with a kind of gentle, reflective nostalgia. He sat down beside her, his presence comfortable and unassuming. She looked up at him and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that still made his heart ache with a quiet joy. "Do you remember," she said, her voice soft, "how frightened I was?" He nodded, taking her hand in his. Her hand fit perfectly in his now, a familiar and precious feeling. "I remember," he said, "and I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture easy and natural. "You gave me a home, Thomas." "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle as he squeezed her hand. "You were the home. I was just the empty house waiting for you." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the light fade. The The dress, a symbol of a past filled with loss and rejection, no longer held any pain. It was simply the beginning of their story, the unlikely preface to this beautiful, quiet life they had built together. The land was still hard, the work was still demanding, and the world outside their small patch of prairie was still a noisy, complicated place. But here, in the circle of their shared love, they had found a peace so profound and a belonging so complete that it felt like the only thing that truly mattered. The shy rancher and the rejected girl from the saloon had found in each other not just what they needed, but everything they had ever wanted.